There are two things that were said today, I read in the paper, that comes from this administration, which tells us that we are obviously in a campaign season and that the words simply are being used in a unique and different way. The President once said that the party of which I belong is currently engaged in a war on the poor, which I find unique because, to be honest, when you have overriding and ever-increasing energy costs, that, as the gentlelady from Wyoming said, that is the real war on the poor. Somebody who is in the bottom portion of our economic sphere, our economic status, will pay 3 times as high a percentage of their income for increased energy prices as those who are in the top will. So if you have a nice urban job, you may have an inconvenience as energy prices go up, but if you're one of those struggling working families trying to make ends meet, this becomes a unique situation. When gas prices go up from up to $4 or more, climbing towards $5, they may dip down again, but they only rise one more time. It hurts the poor far worse than it does any other sector of our country. They are the ones who have the least likely chance of actually having some kind of fuel-efficient automobile. And yet they probably have the greatest chance of needing desperately that car simply to go to work and have no other options whatsoever. They are the ones who will have the most difficult time trying to heat their homes in the middle of winter with increased costs of fuel going up. They are the ones who will recognize, first of all, that whenever the cost of gasoline goes up, the cost of food will also go up, simply because it takes money to send that food to market so that you can buy it. And all of that hits those who are in the lowest sector of our economy harder than those who are in the upper sector of our economy. Like, it's one of the estimates we used a couple of years ago that said for every $420 a family has to pay in increased energy costs, it'll equate to 6,000 jobs that will be lost in the economy. Now, that's one of the problems that we simply find ourselves in. And the sad part about that is we don't have to do it. This is not an energy-poor country. In fact, it is an energy-rich country. We should be using the resources that we have here in the country to enrich ourselves and to help each other to have a better lifestyle, not going worse. And the competition for energy is going to increase as time goes on. There are 6.5 billion people in the world. 2 billion of those 6.5 have no electricity today. They're going to want that in the future, which means our energy needs will be increasing, not diminishing. Doesn't matter what kind of effort you put in there, our energy needs worldwide will be increasing. We have to be able to plan for that. I had a good friend who is one of the CEOs of an energy company today that said when he was in college back in 1973, the word went out there that we were in an energy crisis. We were running out of oil. We had to come up with a way of solving that problem. This is still the Shah's era. So we did. In 1977, we came up with a national energy plan. It was a colossal failure. It was an effort to do centralized planning here in Washington to come up with a way of solving our problem in the future, and it failed miserably. And now, 30 years later, we have people in the bureaucracies of this administration who want to try and reinvent a very bad wheel that didn't work back in the 1970s. You know, someone has to tell this administration and this city that back in 1988, the Berlin Wall fell down, and the idea of centralized plans was discredited throughout the entire world, not only in government but also in industry. Everyone learned that lesson except the bureaucracies here in Washington, where a solution of this administration and far too much that takes place in this city is still the same idea of let's get a big government plan and let the government control everything. We want energy security, but we don't want to drill anywhere. We don't like $4 a gallon of gasoline prices, but we're not ready to increase any refineries anywhere. We don't necessarily want more coal or hydro or nuclear, but we're not ready to come up with any kind of alternative. We don't necessarily want to, we actually do want to have more gas coming in here, but we're not ready to put any pipelines in place to try and make sure that that actually happens. And the end result is we lose. The Western Energy Alliance made the prediction that because of our lack of energy development on public lands in the West, we have lost 16,000 jobs and almost $4 billion of infrastructure investment that comes in there. Secretary of Interior made a speech that called a lot of things we talk about here in Congress the imagined energy world. I think this administration believes in that imagined energy world. It's very easy for this administration to list all their alternative energy projects by name because they have very few of them. They're not moving ahead with solar power. They're not moving ahead with wind power. They're not moving ahead with anything else, and they're not moving ahead with alternative forms either. And this hits us in the West specifically. Now, Mr. Pierce, I don't want to consume too much time. You may want to go another direction, but I'm an old school teacher. So this is one of the areas that has concern to me. This map is obviously the United States. Everything in red is what is controlled by the federal government. You notice that we in the West have the unique opportunity of having 1/2 of everything in the West controlled by the federal government. Federal government controls 1 out of every 3 acres in the nation. And in some of our states, it's like 90%, 70%, 60% of all the land is still controlled by the nation. Now, one of the things that you may say is, well, is that bad? I want to contend to some of my good friends who live in the other parts of the nation that they have an interest in all this red stuff over there because they are shelling out. My good friends who live in the East are shelling out $8 to $9 billion a year in order to control the West, to pay for all this land. Every year in their efforts to make sure that this map stays the same, that's $8 to $9 billion that comes out of their pockets. And what do they get for that investment? They get this map. The states that are in red are the states that have the hardest time funding their education systems over the last several decades. Now, notice once again, the states in red, the area in red is the federal government's own land. The states in red are the ones that have a hard time funding. You notice there is kind of a correlation simply between the two. This is what the states is getting for its $9 billion investment to control the West. We are harming our schools. Now, even in this land that's in the West, we have a huge backlog in maintenance issues. Our National Park Service are hundreds of millions of dollars behind in their maintenance system. There are some states like mine who simply said, you know, this is ridiculous. Our kids are being harmed in their education funding. We can't generate the money we need for our own infrastructure. Why don't you just let us take control of the land, and we will save those pristine areas that need to be saved. We will ensure there is access for recreation and multiple use, and we will develop those resources. The Secretary of Interior today said simply, that concept defies common sense. The idea that only the federal government has the ability and the intelligence to control this kind of land, and that people who live in the states obviously can't do it, defies common sense. So what this means is a federal government that wants to spend more money for land acquisition, that cannot maintain its own land right now, that harms kids in the West with their education funding, that underfunds all the projects that are there right now, and simply wants more and more. That's the common sense. If that indeed is the future, then we have a long, long way to go. We in the West simply have a simple situation. We can do it just as well, if not better, and my argument to you is we can actually do it better. That's what should be common sense. Our kids are being harmed by this system. We are not producing jobs for our kids because of this system. And what I think we need to do in the West is realize this is a country that has energy potential, energy ability, job potential, job ability, and we have kids that definitely need. We in the West, we pay more taxes than they do in the East when you add everything up. We put a higher percentage of our state budgets into education than they do in the East. We actually have higher class sizes than those in the East. We have more kids than those in the East. We need to have the ability of actually meeting our particular needs. And part of that is for this administration to simply realize you've got to help develop the resources that we have. We can control it. We can fund it. We can do it if you give us the opportunity just to move forward. This administration says that we are producing more oil now than ever before because it's all being produced on private property where they can't control it, try as they might to. If they simply unleash the potential in all this red area, this country would move forward in a growth spurt that is almost impossible to imagine. That's the common sense plan.